Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers International, 1-hour discussion of various news events. The number of the program is 742, February the 24th, 1986. Last week I was talking about some matters that all seem to converge together. Ronald Reagan's speech to the State of the Nation, his concern with the budget, with the Star Wars, the AIDS, the disaster of the Challenger, the Shuttle Challenger exploding, and some of the links of space to exploratory work on AIDS and also to advanced genetic sciences out here in California, an international combine. And the way events are developing, I am sure that AIDS is a very big, important project for the military. Now, in the book Alternative 3 that I've mentioned many times, there's a plan for removing 70 to 80% of the population on the earth because they're polluting it. They have no purpose, so to speak. They're just what Reagan, the powers that be, calls, or Hitler called the useless eaters, or the people that just have to be taken care of. It was a plan for genocide that included NASA at the time that this book was written, or from the very beginning of NASA, and an expose or a attempt to understand some of these processes by an English researcher by the name of Leslie Watkins. I mentioned that book to a friend who was over last night, and she said, well, why would they need to do all of that if they had things like diseases and plagues to wipe out large amounts of population, and it's much cheaper? So that the alternate way of eliminating people, blacks, gays, Mexican Americans, and so forth, is easier to do through disease, and that always was a way that Hitler considered eliminating various people, separating them, and getting rid of a large hunk of the deformed and so forth, and then isolating and experimenting on healthy and being very consumed with medicine. So that as events shape up, I cited for you just last week an article from the San Francisco Examiner that has to do with the Hoover Institute, with Stanford Research, with organizations out here in California that are linked to the military. And it reminds me of that nurturing season when Reagan was governor here, with the Office of Emergency Service, with Edwin Meese, with the Garden Plot, and these sinister things that hatched out here with these same people in California. So I want to continue with that article and other items that I gave the outline for last week. And also, before I do that, share with you some of the news stories on the space shuttle. It is getting a lot of coverage, and I'm sure that most of you are keeping up with it, you very careful world watchers, so I don't have to go into the details of all the news, but there are 6 or 7 items that are really important in understanding the way they're rearranging this information, trying to cover up how it's oozing out. One was an article in the Washington Post, February the 9th, Forces Go Awry, A-W-R-Y, I never liked that word anyway, and form an accident chain. Shuttle technology pitted against human error, weather, or politics. Now, the point about that story is that the technology that is pitted against those other factors was such that they were never supposed to go off in frigid weather. Rather, frigid, get those two intertwined, the rigid and the frigid. Well, it was a rigid rule not to go off in freezing weather. Don't blast. The technology was not made, this particular technology, for that kind of weather. The error that they refer to, human error, was the error of ignoring instructions that were going on, as you heard this past week, for 8.5 hours all night while those 7 astronauts were sleeping or resting, ignoring the instructions, and then taking orders from somebody above. And of course, there's a lot of rumors going around in Washington, and you know what I think happened there. The third thing about the weather, this accident chain, that wasn't an accident. It was specified that this is what happens in cold weather. It was always part of the technology, the weather effect on the fuel, on the seams, on the tiles, and on the pipes at the launching pad. And as far as politics, in this particular case, it wasn't the politics of hurrying the shuttle program for somebody's satisfaction. I don't believe that at all. I think it was to use the teacher to cover things like deficits and budget problems, and to give Reagan something upper for his speech to Congress, for the State of the Union speech, as I said before, and also escalating a Star Wars project. The politics was shifting the pressure away, or the activity away from NASA and into the hands of the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Star Wars and the Air Force. Now, Dan Rather on the CBS Evening News, February 18th, that was Tuesday, described the launching and the testimony before the Rogers Commission investigating it, and began the program by saying the launch in the cold was a political decision. And that was spelled out and said very clearly, which is interesting because whether or not you catch Jupiter isn't a political decision. A political decision implies, I believe, the White House, and he said it in such a way that I think your ears would perk up if you happen to hear it. The next article, besides this one about the accident chains, was one in the Washington Times, February the 7th. Engineers doubt that cold caused disaster. Now, I cited that about 2 weeks ago when William Rogers began his commission, because I believe that they bring in a man of that kind to cover up the real facts. And as I cited the first day, they said weather wasn't a factor. Well, the newspaper that has it across the whole top of the page in big black letters, of course, is Arnaud de Borchgrave, the editor for Reverend Moon's newspaper, the Washington Times. In this article, it said that Jesse Moore would set up a devil's advocate committee to attempt to find holes in whatever theories the main NASA team produced to suggest other theories. Well, since that was written, Mr. Jesse Moore has been removed from his position, and Mr. Lovingood, who we cited before, had testified before this group and had even said the weather was in the 50s. So it's interesting to see 3 weeks later how the news carried it in the stories of the unimportance of ice. And as I say, the Washington Times is wonderful at writing these kinds of stories. The author of these stories is Christopher Simpson, and I believe it probably is the same Christopher Simpson who is out here at the house and also was with Pete Carey in San Jose when he was doing a story on Otto von Bolschwing and the TCI Corporation. I believe it was for Penthouse, one of those magazines. And he wrote about Otto von Bolschwing, but left out all the Helene von Damm connections to Ronald Reagan and her links to Reinhard Gehlen and the Gehlen Organization. It's interesting how Tom Bethel, who worked for Jim Garrison, who turned out to be a spy, then works and publishes in Washington Times. John Reese from Western Goals, who always was an agent provocateur and an instigator of disinformation and problems, similar to Arnaud de Borchgrave and his friend Robert Moss. John Reese has had a lot of articles, along with Tom Bethel, in Washington Times, and here I see this by Christopher Simpson. Another early article that came out showed Jesse Moore. This is from the New York Times, February the 7th, and the main thrust of this is that the officials from NASA, the title of the article, are surprised by aggressive questions. Now, there's never been a congressional committee, the Senate Watergate, the Warren Commission, the Korea Gate, that was ever aggressive, and they cited two men who seem to be the ones who spearheaded, as I said before, to go right to the heart of the matter. One was Albert D. Whelan, Wheelon, Senior Vice President of Hughes Aircraft, who's on this committee, and Richard P. Feynman, Feynman, a professor from Caltech. NASA thought that they would be treated nicely and that they could get away with all kinds of avoidance of questions and hard questions. And Mr. Lovingood is cited in this article saying the propellant was 55 degrees, but then he said that it wasn't based on an instrument that measures the heat, but they had it, or the cold, it should be up to 55 degrees. Another interesting article this past week is in the San Jose Mercury, February 18th, with large black letters, the temperature readings appear to raise serious questions about the flow of information from ground crews to the launch pad to top NASA officials. And this goes into the fact that the temperature went down as low as 7 degrees, much lower than the 28 or 23 we cited in the past week. Now we're in the 6s and 7s. And this article says what we don't know is who knew about those temperature readings. And of course that was the big question from the very beginning. and the committee acted surprised that this kind of temperature information didn't flow to top NASA officials. Well, that is an outright lie. This kind of information that came out towards the end of this week was to let you think that, well, some people knew how cold it was, the others didn't know it. They were down there in Florida when the ship launched. They know what cold weather is, and they talked about cold weather on Saturday and Sunday, how Sunday the weather was nice, but it looked like it'd be cold on Monday. If it was cold on Tuesday, they'd delay until Thursday. That's why I know that scratching this shuttle or making it go that day had very little to do with catching Jupiter, that they may have to do that work 13 months from now. But that's not the point. If you don't have a ship, you can't do it at all. And they were cautious about the weather right up to the time when they had to go. So I know, again, to look for the story of who made them go. Another long story in the San Jose Mercury. Panel leader appalled that NASA missed the key data. Decision makers at NASA didn't get key launch data. Now, you have to know propaganda and outright lies when you see them. And this is just a bunch of BS that they didn't know when the temperature drops to those points, or what the temperature does to the pieces of machinery. That's their job to know, and if they're on the phone all night talking about it and they don't know that it's cold in the morning, they want the underlings to take the pressure. Now, the Senate wanted members of their committee investigating NASA to be able to sit in with William Rogers' committee, the commission appointed by the president, and Mr. Rogers won't let them. It would duplicate information and papers going back and forth. If they heard the question asked by Rogers' committee, the senator's aides or senators could hear it and then discuss it between themselves. So there was a part of this one story, and many of you might have seen it. Rogers resisted repeated attempts by members of the Senate Science Subcommittee, which has NASA budget oversight, to allow the senators to sit on the commission's closed session. Senator Donald Regal of Michigan and Hollings pressed the demand, but Rogers, with exasperation, rebuffed them on the grounds of the separation between the president and the Congress and ruled it out. Now, that is why they call it a president's commission. The president's commission to investigate the murder of John Kennedy. The president's commission covered up Lyndon Johnson's role in the murder of John Kennedy, the covering it up or knowing of it in advance, because he appoints the commission, and their rule is to keep away from the throne. At the time of the Watergate Committee, it was the president's commission. They were investigating Richard Nixon, and it was their role, Senator Sam Ervin and the whole gang, to see that it never went back to Dallas, Texas, to the murder of Kennedy, to the anti-Castro Cubans that were involved in the murder of Kennedy, and the Bay of Pigs operations, to keep it from the president. And so in the Koreagate investigation, of course, was just a farce too. But the President's Commission is separate from Congress. Even when you have something like a huge space shuttle blowing up that the American people pay for, we send the people to Congress and they decide where the debts or the cash flow. And they said, no, you can't sit on this. We represent the president, not the Congress. Well, that's an old mafia leader from way back with close roots to George Smathers, former senator, and to Bebe Rebozo and Mr. Alba Knapp and Richard Nixon, and Resorts International. And I just briefly mentioned some of his background. Many of you know it. So that's Mr. Rogers. I represent the president, so Congress can't sit in. Now, the Los Angeles Times had a long story, February 15th. White Knight sought for demoralized space agency. They don't know who will run the space agency. They're into so much trouble. Well, White Knight was the code word for Jim Jones. Some people thought he was around and didn't die and then was dumped out of an airplane. They won't find a Jim Jones for a White Knight. And this is part of the fairy tale belief of Ronald Reagan and his mentality that somebody under those terms is going to come along. I imagine maybe he would like to think of Henry Kissinger. He gave them the role for Central America, and maybe with Kissinger's close relationship to Daniel Graham and Fritz Kramer and the Star Wars gang, I wouldn't surprise if they turned all NASA over to Star Wars and let somebody like Henry Kissinger have one more crack at ruining up this country. A subscriber to World Watchers sent me an article from New Women magazine, February 1986, The Right Stuff, How an Ordinary Teacher, Wife, and Mother Became the First Private Citizen in Space. And of course, there were marked pages here for me to read. It said in the early stages, when she was being considered as an astronaut, Miss McAuliffe's diary helped keep her alive. Interesting the way they refer to the diary by virtue of its very simplicity. Keeping a diary seemed like a gutsy move. What's gutsy about a diary? Always is a diary. The Harvey Oswald, Artie Bremer, and Sirhan and John Hinckley. And what's unusual to make some notes about your experiences. And the disgusting thing is they don't wait until the ship goes up, space shuttle, and then comes down. And she wasn't the first ordinary person on there at all. That Mr. Walker from the Johnson & Johnson laboratory and McDonnell Douglas he was just an ordinary person, a lab worker. What's so unusual? And all this propaganda and media they feed us so much garbage on garbage, and who cares about the diary? But it just shows how they're anxious to get stories out, and they write about her landing before the thing ever took off and blew away. Another article in the Los Angeles Times, Chain of Errors Doomed the Shuttle. And they confuse and have a long list of black kinds of errors, the human errors, the design flaws, the cold weather, all may have led to the tragedy. And this is similar to the very first article I cited about the human error, the weather, and the politics. This leaves out the name politics, but many factors converged to bring about the disaster. So you can't just blame the weather. You throw the weather in with it was just bad judgment, human judgment. They were fighting about whether to launch or not, and they knew they shouldn't launch. And they're diverting away from the fact that this ship, as I say, wasn't made to go in that kind of weather, and they all knew it, and they were watching it very carefully. So they string the weather and the judgment and the human error. Of course it was all those things, and get them all mushed together. But if you think carefully, you can figure out exactly what happened and how it's covered up, and the way it's unfolding is really interesting. Now, last week I was talking about Ronald Reagan and AIDS, because AIDS and military with AIDS and AIDS in California, and the drastic steps that are being taken are really scary, and I very seldom go into such depths with a particular article, but once in a while I do, because most of it I don't want you to miss one bit of the meaning of this particular article. And I'm going to continue where I left off last week so that we can share some more of this story. The title was Drastic Measures Disputed in AIDS Study by David Kirp, K-I-R-P, San Francisco Examiner, Sunday, February the 9th. And it has to do with two of the senior Hoover Institution scholars in Palo Alto who do economic and political analysis, who are part of this studies. One is Rita Ricardo Campbell, a leading contender to succeed Margaret Heckler, heaven help us, who's working on these studies of AIDS to show that AIDS is communicated by casual contact, by breathing, by handling doorknobs and so forth, that even though the scientific community says this isn't true, the military and the Stanford group are going to show that it is true. And as I warned before, when they set their minds to something, they really go into it and set about to get that into your heads as well. The other person working with Rita Ricardo Campbell is Richard Starr, who's a specialist on the Soviet Union, who headed the American delegation of the Mutual Annual and Balanced Force Reduction talks between 1981 and 82. And out of Stanford Research, SRI, and a group called AIMS, Advanced Investigation Medical Science Group, and the Institute for Cancer Research, who've done classified work for biological and chemical warfare. You can hear the broadcast number 741 to get the back things that I mentioned on that particular broadcast. But continuing with this article and material I didn't have last week, some of the rhetoric of the funding proposal, this article says, wasn't driven out of a literal belief that AIDS will decimate the population, but by a desire to scare the military into funding the research, that they know it won't necessarily be carried, AIDS, that way, but if the military is scared, they'll give us the money. The assertion that AIDS is easily transmitted directly conflicts with repeated statements made by the Center for Disease Control out of Atlanta, Georgia, and the National Institute for Health. But this article goes on to say that Dr. Francis, former chief of CDC's AIDS task force, the very group, Centers for Disease Control, that says AIDS isn't transmitted that way, Dr. Francis, who's currently working with the California Department of Health Services on AIDS, has been identified in this proposal, along with Stanford and SRI and Ames, to the military, for this proposal to the military, as a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee. So he jumps from CDC, where he knows that the way AIDS is transmitted isn't done this way, and goes with the military and Stanford to prove that it could be transmitted in this way. The article says the proposal also stresses the danger of female-to-male transmission of the disease, particularly through contact with servicemen and prostitutes. Then it goes on, the most scientifically interesting aspect of the proposal, other researchers say, is a claim that the Institute for Cancer Research has developed a technique to spot AIDS virus that is faster and more reliable than anything that is used now, any blood test now. And the as yet unproven technique on all service personnel would be a major component of the research proposal to give this test that is not given in other places to every person in the military. One of the most troubling aspects of the research proposal is to call for studies that lead to social isolation of AIDS victims and others considered at risk for the disease. And that's what the title was about, the concern when this article opened up. The article goes on, the behavioral modification research program that is contemplated as part of this project would involve restriction on the access of military personnel to other high-risk groups, that they would be separated from what they considered high-risk groups. And this, of course, is gays, and that is one of the purpose, to separate individuals who are at work away from gays so they don't expose them to the risk. The possibility of quarantine for those who can be shown through testing to have been exposed to AIDS is explored in a memo titled Legal Social Considerations, prepared by a member of the research team. And they say, and I might have mentioned this last week, it continues towards the end of the article, with a pandemic of catastrophic potential, extraordinary steps may be necessary, according to the internal memos of Ames and others working on the project from Stanford, the Hoover Institute, Stanford Research, the Ames, the AIMS, and the other cancer investigative bodies with a pandemic of catastrophic potential. These steps range from state-mandated registration of individuals with AIDS to the need for and feasibility of quarantine, register them in your states, or quarantine them, and the feasibility and mandatory and overt identification. So you register, you quarantine, and you identify, however loathsome the Star of David concept is. And they refer to it by the Star of David concept, and the article goes on that Mr. Thor of the Institute of Cancer Research said he was uncomfortable with the Star of David image. I don't like inflammatory labels. He works at the Institute for Cancer Research, but Star of David image means identifying Jews the way Adolf Hitler did. He doesn't like it to have a name like the Star of David. The identification of AIDS people isn't bad, but people may get up in arms because they make the parallel between Nazi Germany, so it bothers him that you have this image, but they use it in their literature and go on to say that, well, it's bad, that is what they're calling it, the Star of David image. The military's $40 million AIDS research program received little scrutiny by Congress or the news media since it was hurried through last September at the very end of the budget-making process. And many of you who listen to World Watchers every week know how outraged I was to read that $40 million was going to the military to work on AIDS. And the article concludes, at the time, critics questioned whether the military would do credible AIDS research, and I guess you would classify me among those critics, When the generals lost DIVAD, a tank scrapped by the Secretary of Defense as ineffective, they insisted on money for AIDS. "We will give you DIVAD, you give us money for AIDS," said one congressional source. They had seen in the preliminary figures on AIDS in the military, and they panicked. They were concerned over briefings on AIDS conducted last summer to the Defense Department officials in 1985. There were virologists and infectious disease specialists painting a grim picture of the spread of AIDS to non-high-risk population. One claim was that more servicemen would die from AIDS before Reagan left office than died in Vietnam. That certainly got the attention of the admirals and generals. Defense Department officials working with Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska, a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, got the $40 million for AIDS research. They tacked it onto a defense budget. None of the money has been spent yet, but a lot of the defense money could go back to Stanford for this project, and these people are linked to chemical and biological warfare. That is very scary. Now, I want to continue with some of the articles that I briefly mentioned in my outline last week pertaining to Ronald Reagan's pitch for his Star Wars, his defense systems, his new Star War airplane, and his concern with AIDS, and give you some more specifics about these various items and how they relate to each other. On broadcast number 657, this was July 9th, 1985, a year and a half ago, I cited an article in the San Francisco Chronicle that came out July the 8th, 1984, just around that same time. Navy considered closing their lab, but new mission found for it. They were going to close their biological chemical warfare lab in the Bay Area, but they decided they could use it for other things. Now, is it being used again for this program that they're going into to use the military and Stanford research for some more testing of cancer and immune systems? The article then said starting in 1950 through 1970, there's a laboratory in Oakland, California that was making plague and tularemia and lethal mist to test first on animals and then to test germ warfare on how it spread throughout the San Francisco Bay. And you know that outside of New York City, the largest AIDS population is right there in San Francisco, right across the bay from where labs were testing ways to break down the elderly or the debilitated. This test, the germ warfare, was dangerous to the elderly and debilitated, and those are the people that Hitler and the Nazis didn't like. The U.S. Army facility at Fort Detrick, Maryland, today still makes diseases to pass around. That was in 1984, a year and a half ago. And Advanced Genetic Sciences opened up their offices in Oakland, California, in the same city, not coincidentally, in 1969. Now, the story is that they started labs in 1950 to 1970, but in 1969, maybe they closed the lab there in Oakland, but AGS opened up in Oakland, and they opened with Mr. Diot and Mr. Adams. Diot came out from Princeton University, and Mr. Adams opened it up. He was the member of the law offices of Sullivan and Cromwell that I cited last week, and he came to a place known as Oakland, California, where they would put $20 million into experimenting with putting live genetically altered bacteria into strawberries and potatoes, not to see the frost. They admit now it's not the frost, it's that it travels. How far will these genetically altered bacteria with one gene removed travel? So in 1970, if that office was closed, in 1969, AGS was set up. First they tested animals and then germ warfare. They admitted it was dangerous to these various people, that they were still making these diseases. And the article went on to say they made viruses, mysterious organisms, infections that would affect human beings, and they can lie dormant for many years, progressively and relentlessly destroying brain and nervous tissue. And I think of the preponderance of Alzheimer's disease and the brain disease AIDS affects the brain. That's one of the big factors that it does affect, is the brains. And I cited in 1984 the Alzheimer, the swine flu, the Legionnaires, the disease progeria that I believe is a man-made disease for people that turn old ahead of their time, young people. And I cited Tay-Sachs and AIDS and sickle cell and some of these diseases that affect the young, the blacks, and so forth. We'll take a 1-minute break. As I say, in July of 84, I was talking about AIDS and these mysterious organisms and talking about a laboratory that opened up in Oakland that was allegedly supposed to be closed in 1970, and now in 1985, we have learned, 1986 rather, that AGS opened up in 1969 in the same city of Oakland and is working on altered genetics and bacteria that could affect the immune system. I said before, we'll really do it now. We'll take a 1-minute break and continue with some news stories that I cited in part of the overview, but want to get into detail as much as time allows for the rest of this program. This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 742, February 24th, 1986. I forgot to mention when I began the program that World Watchers is going to continue. I was going to finish 15 years on the air as of June 30th of 1986. That is a good hunk of years to be on every single week without missing a program, and I thought that I would like to write some books and articles and put a lot of attention into the writing. But with events that come up such as the space shuttle, the disaster there, and the problem of AIDS and the problem of advanced genetic scientists and the various, there's thousands of on-running news stories that I've shared with you through the years, and many of the pieces of those puzzles now are coming into view. It's much more important to take the weekly news as it comes and share that with you. The news each week is alive, and I realize when these events come down like they have in the last few weeks, how much I'm in touch with various friends and writers and subscribers to the tapes and activists, and we share information and people mail me information, and I'm so grateful, and it enlarges my knowledge by what I receive from them, and they can keep track each week of what I am doing. And this radio work is so much a part of my experiences and the people I know and really love that it's a shame to cut it off. The written book, the written word is sometimes understood and not sometimes understood, but the media, the videotape and the tape cassette is really a good way to communicate with people. I've been satisfied with it, and the radio work the way it is. So for those of you that were worried and concerned, and some of you were very concerned about us not being able to exchange on a weekly basis, or even more often than that, all of this information, I decided that it was just impossible to have a cutoff date. So as long as I'm around and you're around, we're in it together, and I will continue the radio work as I have done and share it with you. So don't worry. You can subscribe to the tapes, and you can listen to the broadcast, and I will continue on the air. I forgot, as I say, to mention that the program. Now, I did hand out at Monterey County Supervisors Meeting a slip of paper with quotation from that book, The Higher Form of Killing, that I've shared with you before. David Emery bought me that book, The Secret Story of Chemical and Biological Warfare. And again, in that book, it talks out about Fort Detrick, Maryland, and the possibility of a super germ that could be produced in a laboratory that would affect the immune system. So Fort Detrick is the same place that was cited in articles in 1984 exposing those labs in Oakland from 1970 to 1950 to 1970, and then 1969 AGS moves out to the West Coast. I also handed out and shared with you on the air a group called CROPEC, CROPEC, which is typical of the monopolies that go on, whether IG Farben with their various monopolies and their dyes and their chemical monopolies, and OPEC, the oil monopolies. CROPEC has to do with food monopolies and directors of the Chase Manhattan that control food as well as oil. And Chase Manhattan and the Rockefellers are important also as having a Rockefeller Institute, going into medical experimentations, medical research, and they don't limit their specialties to such as oil or dyes or foodstuffs. They go into the systems of the body, the immune systems, and cancer viruses, and mingle their profits with the weapons of biological warfare that can wipe out people while at the same time they can multiply their profits. Now, one of the articles I cited just by title last week that I want to share the details is called $1 billion Grant for Biomedicine. It was February the 3rd in the New York Times by Kathleen Telsch, Teltsch. It has to do with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Howard Hughes is one of the most interesting and scary persons that ever came across the political warfare scene in the United States, and I have 4 filing cabinet drawers, one entire cabinet just filled with papers on Howard Hughes and every book that's been written about Howard Hughes, and there weren't very many, and of course I feel that I have studied him a lot to come to some very scary opinions and feelings about the Hughes organization. And Howard Hughes set up a medical institute that used to be run by Marvin Gaye, his associate, who was a chauffeur who ran the institute in Florida, and money would go and profits do go from Hughes aircraft, and that's now been sold to General Motors, but that huge chunk of profits, it still goes to the Medical Institute after the sale. And the Hughes Medical Institute has a place in Florida where it's a dummy front, a little tiny building, and now it has gone to Bethesda, Maryland, which is right next to the Central Intelligence Agency, and Hughes was the CIA. Robert Mayu, who worked for Howard Hughes, worked for the CIA and FBI and worked with anti-Castro Cubans and Guy Bannister and John Rosselli and Sam Giancana and people behind the murder of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. It was the umbrella, I always said, for the Nazification of America. So when the Howard Hughes Medical Institute hands out their money, and they don't always tell you where it goes. You're just going to get an overview here, and then you have to have a very good imagination and get out some files of past work of these particular institutions. They announced just 2 weeks ago that $1 billion would be spent in the next 5 years, and Dr. Donald S. Fredrickson, president of the Institute, said that they will send money to 22 laboratories and teaching facilities that include 14 states. That some laboratories now are operated by the Institute, and some are just being built. The Hughes Institute has its headquarters, this article says, in Bethesda, and when they give away this $1 billion, which is hundreds of millions, they don't have to dip into their capital. This is just the interest on money that they have. This was a tax write-off for used aircraft to put into our body and body system, and as of yet today, I can't think of one medical thing that they've come up with, or they certainly haven't advertised anything they've done with their billions of dollars. Dr. Fredrickson said that the Institute was the sole owner of Hughes aircraft until it was sold just recently. It was created in 1953 by Mr. Hughes. Actually, Howard Hughes had an airplane accident in which he was almost killed, and Vern Mason, the doctor who got him better and well, created the idea of the Institute, and partly Howard wasn't supposed to be able to take care of his own affairs, and this institute was manipulated and put together, and I have not all the legal papers, but the background papers on the institute. Later, Vern Mason was murdered. He set this up, and if you know that when a man called Howard Hughes was buried, it actually was a Vance Cooper, but that skeleton, either one, was down to about 80 pounds with needles in its body and dehydrated and compared to a corpse at Auschwitz. So this gives you some idea of how the Medical Institute took care of Howard Hughes, and so if you want to know what happens to you, look back into the history of April 1976 when a body from Mexico, dead, was flown in to Houston, Texas, and you realize what technology they used on that corpse, and goodness knows there was no interest in that particular person's kidneys or nourishment or well-being. But anyway, the article goes on about the money. Most of the research undertakings will be in 4 areas of specialization, and I just touched on them briefly last week: in genetics, immunology, metabolic control, and neuroscience. I mean, okay, because I mistrust the whole Hughes outfit from A to Z, and if you've read 3 books on Hughes, you'd get scared that they have a medical institute at all. The article goes on, over $100 million will be spent in the Boston area for research at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and one of the directors of AGS is on the board and active at Massachusetts General Hospital, Children's Hospital, the most vulnerable of all people, of course, the little children, and the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Fredrickson said that they'll be singling out the program with these three hospitals as exemplifying the Institute's approach. The important element is that we create a new capacity for interaction between those engaged in fundamental research in molecular genetics, and those engaged in sophisticated application of this research to clinical problems. Molecular genetics and sophisticated applications of this research. Now, the advanced genetic sciences were going to take their bacteria, and they had it listed as a pesticide, and I mentioned this before because in California, the local area can't control what pesticides are used, but it is a living bacteria, and when asked at the hearings, what's the pesticide, they said, well, cold weather's a pest. So if you fight cold weather, you're a pesticide. But they're going into molecular genetics and their application. So trying to put an altered bacteria, genetically altered with one gene removed, into these fields to see how far it spreads, and admitting, okay, even if you don't have frost, we'll see how it travels, could be a sophisticated application of research, and that's all it is. And the people up at AGS have said that they've spent $20 million, so where did they get the buckaroos again to spend the $20 million and the money from overseas? It easily is sent over there and then comes back into our valley. The new facilities in New York that are being built include a building adjacent to the Children's Hospital in Boston, a new research facility at Rockefeller University in New York, and some of the team from AGS came from Rockefeller, and used by the Institute and the university in a center for molecular medicine at Yale University. Oh boy, there's so many things that ring in my head when I hear about Yale and sending research money there. They're also going to put funds into Columbia University, Johns Hopkins, Duke University, Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, Vanderbilt University in Nashville and Tennessee, Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and at Stanford University. So it will be going to Stanford, and then they will send money to Pennsylvania, Chicago, Texas, Michigan, Washington, and Utah, and the University of California, Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco. Of course, Los Angeles is where Dr. Jolly West worked with Ronald Reagan to plan to put electrodes into the heads of prisoners and poor to test their ability to resist temptations to anger or frustration, translated as violence, and medically making zombies out of people and creating violence in laboratories and releasing these people out large in the university, from university laboratories onto society to do a lot of the crimes that are done later, such as Donald DeFreeze and the Patty Hearst kidnapping, and the use of the criminal conspiracy section of the police departments, working closely with the University of California and also the police with Jim Jones and their experimentations with Stanford Research, the Stanford Institute down in Jonestown, Jim Jones having a supply of drugs enough for a population of 10,000 people. The universities are very good at taking money and putting it in places that to be allowed to test not only minorities, but to test very bright people like that Leonard Keeley in Boston I mentioned before, who had this brain operation, electrode implants. He became violent. They removed the thinking or feeling parts of his brain and reduced him to a vegetable with some of the fine staff at the Boston Hospital back there. And also Howard Hughes himself left Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, California in 1966 and was taken to a hospital in Boston and then was never physically ever seen again after they did some surgery on the brain. So having a lot of money doesn't mean that people won't take it from you or kidnap you or drug you or experiment on you. And there is no one to say that they saw him. Robert Mayu never saw him, and all the top people, Chester Davis and people that worked with Hughes. There were 5 nurses, the Mormon Mafia, who saw him. But the hospitals in Utah and the Mormons are the recipients of a lot of this medicine also. And goodness knows, after you can do a disappearing act with a man that rich and famous, how easy it is to do with just the ordinary person. Now, the details of another story on the Hughes trustees came out of the Los Angeles Herald April 27, 1984, when the Hughes aircraft was making the transition from, it soon would be going, they didn't say they were headed for sale then, they sold it in 1985 to General Motors, but they were changing the controls of the Hughes Medical Institute at this time. There was described as a 6-year legal battle over who would run the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, because the Hughes aircraft in California ended with the appointment of 8 trustees for the Institute. So the military, the Air Force, very important with the shuttle, with the launching, with the Star Wars, the SDI, the Air Force, and the Hughes aircraft made the decision of who on the board of the Hughes Medical Institute would decide where this money would go, and 8 trustees, it was agreed upon, would take over. Since Hughes' death in 1976, and the article doesn't say since Vance Cooper's death, that's who's in the grave, they say Howard Hughes, the Institute has been run by its executive committee. In 1978, then Delaware Attorney General Richard Weir filed suit in court, maintaining that the committee didn't have any power anymore to take control under the terms of Hughes' will, because Hughes was the sole trustee. So there was a legal battle, and the Institute has offices in Miami, but the president of the Institute, listed as new trustees, is George W. Thorne, who also administered to Howard Hughes, and Frank W. Gay, appointed to be the Institute's executive committee in 1971, former chief executive of the Hughes-owned Summa Corporation, Donald Fredrickson, former director of the National Institute of Health, Irving Shapiro, former chief executive officer of DuPont, Hannah Gray, president of the University of Chicago, Helen Copley, chairman of the Copley Newspapers, headquarters in San Diego, James Gilliam, senior vice president of Beneficial Corporation, and William Lewis, a nephew of Howard Hughes. But the important people on this board to continue the future of where the money is going are from the DuPont Company, the University of Chicago, and those people can make some very, very important decisions in the future. Now, the article that I cited on the outline of EPA approving the genetic test last week, that one October the 30th, 1985, told about the White House pressures. The Environmental Protection Agency is caving in for pressures to push the experiment of a genetically altered bacteria. And even though this experiment was blocked in 1983, the White House was putting pressure. Now, you notice that with all the articles on pollution, with the Buford scandal, with the James Watt scandal, they never put pressure on Environmental Protection Agency to clean up any particular area. And in fact, they ordered them not to, because Jerry Brown, running for the office of Senate, might get some brownie points. So when the EPA gets pressure, it is to work with genetically altered organisms, not to clean up what we have here that's literally killing us off. And this article came out just the end of the year. A California biotechnology company is expected to win federal approval within the next 2 weeks, pardon me, for the release in the environment of a genetically altered living organism. And as I mentioned last week on World Watchers, they still call it a California company when the money comes from Belgium, and it comes from Sweden, and it comes from Rome and Haas. It was set up with their German brothers over there, Mr. Haas being an American living in Philadelphia, but Mr. Rome being German and working as part of IG Farben and with DuPont. They still refer to this company as being an Oakland company when it is a splinter of a larger group. This group never made they lost $6 million last year. They never made the $20 million in Oakland that they said they have put into this testing so far. So the articles still cry small, and they're not small. And it's a wonder that they can get away with this. These dummy fronts, they've always been noticed as small, and the connections to the mommy and daddy just seem to be separated all of this time. Wednesday, October 30th, 1985, there was an article in the Oakland Tribune, Oakland firm set for first in genetics, and again, telling them that how Oakland is, that firm is going to roll along, and that the University of California a laboratory expert there, Steve Lindau, has been working on these experiments, and that he is ready to roll with the biotech industry. And as soon as the EPA gives approval, they clear the way, and they're on their way. Now, the corporate directory of AGS, I just want to read you the names and the places where they come from, because, as I say, the articles give you this little bitty company from Oakland, and again, the story, No Strawberry Fields Forever here, out of the San Francisco Examiner, February the 16th, cites David Andrews, a lawyer hired by Advanced Genetic Sciences, for saying the company has spent 6 years and $20 million in research on the bacteria. And from what I've heard, they've made up their minds down there, and I gave this to you before, that they take it upon themselves to stand in front of the federal and state government, and they want to drive the industry out of the United States and go on out. And then he says there's a real education job to be done. I'm not sure a small company can take it on, and I cite that for you again to show you just how small it is. We're just an itsy-bitsy little company, and we put this money in, and if you don't like it, we may take it out of the United States. And I said, good, goodbye, go. Well, here are the people according to their corporate directory, and you see if it's a small company in California. Daniel D. Adams, I cited as chairman and chief executive. He came out of the offices of Sullivan and Cromwell that represent IG Farben, and the company that made the extermination gas, the 34 million LSD. Alan and John Foster Dulles are from and work with the Sullivan and Cromwell offices, and Daniel Adams came out here in 1969 to set up AGS. Thomas M. Diotte, Ph.D., President and Chief Operating Officer. He is the one from Princeton University who came out here to take over when the approval was turned down in 1984, 83. He said, I'm coming out anyway, and eventually we'll get what we want. John R. Bedbrook, Ph.D., Vice President and Director of Research. Anthony G. Markert, M-A-R-K-E-R-T, Vice President, Finance and Chief Financial Officer. Pat Milaga, Ph.D. Now, he's from Hungary, Eastern European connections. He's listed as Director of Cell Biology. David Sarajak, Ph.D., Director of Marketing and Production. Ann Lang, Director of Corporate Communications. And then we get into the people out of this area, too. John Maynard is one of the officers on the board, the corporate secretary. He's senior partner of Reboll, McMurray, Hewitt, Maynard, and Crystal, a New York law firm. And then Daniel Adams as the board of directors. Those are the officers. Daniel Adams, again, Sullivan, Cromwell, board of directors. Thomas Diotte from Princeton on the board of directors. And Lawrence Bogorod, whose biography I gave to you before, who's professor of biology and head of the biology department under the Maria Moore's Cabot, the Henry Cabot Lodge Group in Boston, Massachusetts. He's in the biology department at Harvard. Arne Emanuelson, managing director, he's on the board, from Hillshog AB, Hilleshog, from Landskrona, Sweden, and a hunk of the money comes from Sweden. And Robert E. Naylor, Jr., Ph.D., I've described him in the past few weeks, from Roman Haas Company in Philadelphia, and he also worked for DuPont, and he's the common board of director member between Roman Haas, this huge multi-billion-dollar corporation that has been accused in courts of having pesticides or chemicals that caused cancer in human beings. Roderick B. Thompson, private investor from Hamilton, Bermuda, money coming up here from Bermuda to the company. B.F. Wesson, senior vice president. He's from Smith, Barney, Harris, Upman and Company in New York, Smith, Barney. Then they go to the scientific board, includes Lawrence Bogorod, a professor of biology from Harvard, and John Bedbrook, Ph.D. from Berkeley, California, working with Advanced Genetic Sciences. Niels Olof Bosbark, Ph.D. from Landskrona, Sweden, where the money bucks come in from Sweden. Howard M. Goodman, Ph.D., Chief of the Department of Molecular Biology, Massachusetts General Hospital, and they're recipients of the Howard Hughes aircraft military money that goes through Bethesda, Maryland, up to Massachusetts General. Professor of genetics at Harvard. Goodman is also professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, Boston, Massachusetts. And then I briefly described Pat Maliga, PhD, Director of Cell Biology for AGS in Berkeley, section head of the Institute of Plant Physiology in Szeged, Hungary, Szeged, Hungary Biological Research Center. Joseph Schell, Schell, on the scientific board of AGS, director of the Max Planck Institute for Plant Improvement, and I don't know if I'll have time this week to describe the Nazification of Max Planck, but we can get into that next week. He's co-director for Genetics Research Laboratory from the University of Ghent in Ghent, Belgium, and you understand that the people from Sweden, Hungary, and Belgium have no frost that they can test. They've got to do it out here in nice, warm Monterey County. Charles Tatum is a member of the scientific board managing exploratory agriculture research from Roman Haas from Springhouse, Pennsylvania, and Mark Van Montague, PhD science director of Plant Genetic Systems Laboratory out of Ghent, Belgium, co-director of Genetic Research Laboratory, University of Ghent, Belgium, putting our bacteria, the live genetic with one gene removed, to see how it travels out here in California. The auditors for this company, I mentioned once before, Arthur Anderson from the Avenue of Americas in New York, that's 6th Avenue, the transfer agent and registrar for their funds, because we're talking about 20 million already that they said they put into this bacteria that they want to put on a few strawberry leaves out here. Morgan Guaranty Trust Company of New York City, 30 West Broadway. Don't tell me this isn't big bucks from Bermuda, from Smith Barney, from the Morgan Guaranty Trust, from Belgium, from Sweden, from Max Planck Institute. There's a lot of power in this organization, and also they have offices, the Biofrost in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, and Plant Genetic Systems in Ghent, Belgium, and in Brussels, Belgium, with their overseas telex numbers and so forth. It can't be very small. In their book on frostband, a member of the World Watchers, not a member, you're all members. Anyone who listens is a member. I guess the official membership is getting articles and sharing research, and in their brochure for the past year, they said for 1984, we had a net loss of $6,997,506. I always wonder if it wasn't 507 and they put it 6 when they go down to that last dollar. The loss was in line with our expectations, but has not substantially detracted from the progress we are making to bring our initial product to the market. We can now foresee AGS becoming a full self-supporting system. AGS intends to substantially increase the dollar amount of its research contracts in 1985. This is feasible because of our recent progress. It has been firmly established the excellence of our Berkeley laboratory, while all of it's coming from over there. AGS has secured commitments from its major industrial shareholders, the major industrial Roman Haas Company, Hilshog, AB, and AB Aritmos, those are from Sweden, and also from Belgium, and for an aggregate of $2.2 million in funding as part of a larger financing package being arranged among European investors by a leading European investment banking firm. This is AGS in Monterey County, with their money coming from links to the past that are scary and to their moving into this area. Now, this article, No Strawberry Fields Forever, I can share some of that with you for a few moments. The uproar, this is the way it was written by Catherine Seligman. The uproar over the nation's first field test of genetically altered bacteria in Monterey County strawberry field already has resulted in a lawsuit. Last week, the county supervisors blocked the experiment for 45 days in a move that could affect the commercial future of biotechnology in California. Again, why bring it to California? Go take it somewhere else. If the future of all this is so important, test it in your own backyard. The article goes on, the negative reaction came as a surprise to scientists after hearings they had at the Advanced Genetic Sciences. They planned to spray these tiny organisms on strawberry plants to see if they would colonize. We are convinced the science is safe, but some people have watched TV shows that are Frankensteinian in nature. said Douglas Sarajak, a plant pathologist and director of the Oakland-based company. We spent this much time and we still find there's an information gap and we don't know why. Scientists are thinking of having an animated cartoon made or visiting high school biology classes to explain the state-of-the-art technology that is spooking the prime agricultural county in the nation. It's too bad Crista McAuliffe isn't alive because you have a teacher in space and she could teach the high schools while she's at it. State-of-the-art technology that is spooking the prime agricultural county. It's the most benign conceivable thing in the world, said Dr. David Kingsbury, Assistant Director of the National Science Foundation and a member of the Presidential Biotechnical Sciences Coordinating Committee. Poor AGS just happens to be the first in the country. I must say I feel sorry for them. They must be at their wits' end. And isn't this pitiful? The words that, and then they quote a person who's had a lawsuit against it. The words they do have aren't enough, says Glenn Church, and he grows Christmas trees in the area. It's like the dawn of the nuclear age, Church said. There's a lot of things we could have done differently. I'm afraid in 40 years we'll look back and say we sure made mistakes in the 80s. The bacteria, two strains known as Pseudomonas syringae and Pseudomonas fluorescens, normally live on plants, but by deleting a gene, scientists have created a bacteria that won't allow frost to form, and they want to spray the bacteria in a powder called Frostband on 2,400 strawberries in the fields. And I've given you the gist of this article, and I'll do a little bit more on some of the companies related to this particular firm with you next week. I shared some of this before, but it's very important to understand the relationship between international corporations, banks from the Morgan Guaranty Trust, and Smith Barney and the huge financial companies coming here to this area to test something that may affect the immune system is similar to the federal government putting labs for 20 years into Oakland, and when they're discovered, they quickly close the door, and all of a sudden another company is opened up that comes out of the offices of Sullivan Cromwell, which is chemical and biological warfare. Our time is up now, so I'm going to stop with this. I'll be back with you next week to continue with all the news that is important that we should study that we can put on a program in just 1 hour. This is Mae Brussell, and take care, and I'll be back with you next week.